The stench struck Calder Boone like a physical blow, sweet decay, mingled with the bone-dry heat that had been baking this corner of hell for months. His weathered hand trembled against the warped doorframe as memories crashed over him, unbidden. Another child, another shack, 8 years ago in Arizona territory. That time he'd been tracking a rustler named Miguel Santos, following cold leads and false hope. He'd found little Sarah Mendez chained in a root cellar, her tiny body already claimed by dehydration and despair. Too late. Always too late. The guilt had eaten at him for years, the image of those small bones scattered by scavengers and the echo of his own inadequacy reverberating through sleepless nights and whiskey-soaked attempts at forgetting. He'd sworn then that he'd never fail another child, never let his hunt for bounty money cloud his judgment about what truly mattered. Not again. Dear God, not again. He pushed the door wider, and the sight inside nearly dropped him to his knees. His heart hammered against his ribs, breath catching in his throat like he'd been punched in the solar plexus. A girl sat chained in the corner like a broken doll, so skeletal that every bone showed through translucent skin, stretched tight as parchment. Her dark hair hung in matted ropes around a face that belonged in a graveyard, hollow cheeks, carved deep as canyons, sunken eyes that had seen too much horror, lips cracked and bleeding from months of rationed water. The heavy iron shackle around her ankle connected by thick chain to what remained of a man in tattered clothes bones, picked clean by time, and the small scavengers that thrived in Nevada's merciless desert. She looked up at him with eyes ancient as winter stone, older than her years had any right to be. No fear flickered in those depths. No hope. Just the terrible patience of someone who'd learned that both emotions were luxuries she couldn't afford in this sun-blasted purgatory. "You ain't supposed to be here," she whispered, voice like wind through dried leaves, barely audible in the suffocating silence. Boone's throat closed completely. The girl couldn't be more than 13, but something in her gaze spoke of experiences that would shatter grown men into pieces. Around the small room, rusty pans and tin cups were scattered strategically across the floor, positioned to catch precious rainwater from bullet holes in the roof. Near a shattered window, moldy bread crusts and strips of jerky lay, where someone had tossed them through the gap, charity from a distance, offered by souls too afraid to enter this tomb, but unwilling to let the child starve completely. The parallels to Sarah Mendez were overwhelming. The same desperate positioning of containers to catch water. The same careful rationing of whatever scraps the outside world provided. The same chain that spoke of deliberate imprisonment rather than mere abandonment. "How long have you been here, child?" The words scraped raw from his throat, each syllable fighting past the constriction of old grief and fresh horror. "Since the last snow melted proper." Matter of fact, as if discussing tomorrow's weather prospects. "Papa said if I leave, we're both lost forever. But I reckon I'm lost already, mister. Been lost so long I forgot what found feels like." Boone stepped carefully across scattered animal bones, rats, and other small creatures that had sought shelter in this place and found only death. The chain was prison-grade iron, thick as a man's thumb and heavy enough to anchor a boat, meant for the most dangerous killers in territorial prisons. Where it had rubbed against her ankle for months, infection crawled up her leg in angry red streaks that spoke of blood poisoning and worse horrors to come. His hands clenched into fists as Sarah's ghost whispered accusations in his ear. Another child. Another failure in the making. Another chance to prove that Calder Boone's conscience was just another luxury he couldn't afford in his line of work. "What's your name, child?" "Josie Whitlock. This here's my Papa Hank." Her voice carried an odd note of pride as she touched the skull with surprising tenderness, like stroking a beloved pet. "He made me promise to guard him from the grave robbers and the men who tortured him something fierce. Said they'd come back for what he swallowed before dying." Hank Whitlock. The name stirred memories of saloon whispers and half-drunk conversations in mining camps, a prospector who'd supposedly struck the mother lode before vanishing into the wasteland like morning mist. But looking at these carefully arranged remains at this elaborate prison constructed with deliberate precision, Boone suspected there was far more to the story than simple gold fever. Who did this to him? Who chained you here like an animal? Her face transformed completely, childhood vanishing like smoke in desert wind. What remained was harder than desert stone, aged by experiences no child should survive. Dutch Carver and his gang. They hurt Papa something fierce, trying to make him tell where he hid their treasure. Burned him with hot irons, cut pieces off him while I watched and screamed. But Papa was clever. He swallowed the secret before they could cut it out of his throat. The name hit Boone like a rifle shot to the chest, dragging up 8 years of guilt and second-guessing that had followed him across 3 territories. Dutch Carver, once as close as the son he'd never had, following him around mining camps and cattle towns with bright eyes and eager questions hanging on every word like gospel truth. That was before everything went wrong. Before Boone had turned him into federal marshals on charges of conspiracy and treason. Before Dutch had spent 3 years in Yuma's hellish stone cells, emerging as something twisted and unrecognizable. Before hatred had consumed the boy, Boone had tried to save transforming love into the kind of rage that burned everything it touched. Before Boone had failed another child who trusted him completely, the irony was bitter as alkali water. He'd come here tracking a 2-bit cattle rustler named Jake Morrison, following a cold trail for $50 in bounty money. Instead, he'd found the living consequences of his greatest failure chained to the bones of Dutch's latest victim. "Josie, we need to get you out of here right now. This place ain't safe, not with Dutch Carver involved." "Can't leave Papa not till the job's done proper. I gave my word, and Whitlocks don't break their word no matter what." "What job? What did your father ask you to do?" Before she could answer, the distant thunder of hoofbeats echoed across the hardpan, carried on the desert wind like the sound of approaching doom. Multiple riders coming hard and fast across the wasteland, with the urgency of men who'd been searching for something valuable. His hand moved instinctively to his Colt .45, muscle memory honed by years of staying alive in a business where hesitation meant a shallow grave in unmarked desert. "That's them," Josie whispered, pressing against the wall like prey scenting predators on the wind. "Dutch and his boys. They come back regular every few weeks, looking for what Papa hid inside himself before they killed him." Through the cracked window, 5 riders materialized from the heat shimmer like demons rising from hell itself. Even at distance, Boone recognized Dutch's distinctive slouch in the saddle, the way he favored his left side, where a Yuma Guards club had cracked ribs that never healed properly. The black hat pulled low over eyes that had once sparkled with hero worship, now burned with the kind of hatred that could consume a man's soul. The other riders were hard cases, professional killers with dead eyes and hands that rested easy on gun grips. The kind of men who'd shoot a child as readily as swatting a fly, then sleep soundly afterward without a trace of conscience. Boone grabbed a heavy iron file from beneath loose floorboards, hands shaking as he attacked the shackle around Josie's infected ankle with desperate fury. Each scrape of metal on metal echoed like thunder in the suffocating silence. Sweat poured down his face, mixing with decades of accumulated dust and grime. The file slipped in his sweaty grip, opening his palm to the bone and sending blood streaming down his wrist. "Hurry, mister," Josie breathed, watching the dust cloud grow larger with each passing second. "Dutch gets real mean when he's been drinking tequila, and he's been drinking steady since he got out of Yuma. Last time he came, he talked about burning this place down with me, still chained inside, just to see Papa's bones turn to ash." The shackle finally snapped with a sound like breaking bones and the iron parting after months of faithful service as Josie's prison. Her ankle was a horror of infected flesh and dried blood bone, visible through gaps where the metal had worn away skin and muscle. But she bit back any sound of pain, showing steel that belied her fragile frame. "Under the floor," she said, pointing to loose boards near her father's remains. Papa showed me the hiding place before they tortured him to death. Said if trouble came, I should go to ground like a prairie dog till it passed. They slipped into the narrow crawl space as the door exploded inward with a crash that shook dust from every rafter. Dutch Carver filled the frame like an avenging angel silhouetted against blazing sun that turned him into a dark cutout against painful brightness. Prison had carved away everything soft about him, leaving sharp angles and knife scars that spoke of brutal years behind bars. His eyes, Jesus, his eyes held the cold emptiness of a man who'd learned to kill without feeling to hurt, without conscience. Well, well, well. That familiar drawl, once warm with affection and respect, now carried winter's bite and the promise of violence. Looks like someone's been playing with my little songbird. Somebody who don't understand the rules of this particular game. 4 hard cases flanked him like wolves around their pack leader killers with dead eyes and easy hands on gun grips, men who'd followed Dutch into hell itself if the pay was good enough. Through gaps in the floorboards, Boone watched Dutch survey the small room with predatory intensity, his gaze lingering on broken shackles and blood drops leading toward their hiding place. Josie, honey, Dutch called out voice-dripping false sweetness that made Boone's skin crawl. Uncle Dutch has some real important questions for you. Questions about what your dear papa swallowed before I cut his lying throat. The word uncle twisted in Boone's gut like a rusty knife. This monster wore the face of a boy he'd tried to save, carried the voice that had once asked innocent questions about tracking and shooting, and what it meant to be a good man. Above them, boots creaked on rotting floorboards as killers spread out like spiders searching with professional thoroughness. I can smell you, Calder. Dutch's whispers somehow carried more menace than shouting would have. That particular stench of righteousness and failure. You always did have a gift for arriving too late to matter, for sticking your nose where decent folks didn't want it. A boot crashed through the floorboard inches from Josie's head, showering them with splinters and decades of accumulated dust. She pressed against Boone's shoulder, trembling like a trapped rabbit. The crawl space was barely 3 feet high, filled with desert sand and the bones of countless small animals that had sought shelter and found only death. Pike checked the back room real careful, Dutch ordered with cold authority. Sanderson, watch that window. Nobody gets out breathing unless I say different. Martinez, tear this place apart board by board if you have to. Pike, scarred and vicious with tobacco-stained teeth and eyes like chips of flint, moved with the fluid grace of a born predator. Sanderson, younger but equally deadly, positioned himself where he could cover both the door and the broken window with his sawed-off shotgun. Martinez, a Mexican killer with ritual scars covering his arms, began systematically destroying the shack's meager furnishings. Found where they went to ground, boss, Martinez called out, pointing at the disturbed floorboard with obvious satisfaction. That's when hell erupted in earnest. Boone rolled out of the crawlspace with his Colt already clearing leather muscle memory taking over as conscious thought fled. His first 2 shots took Martinez's center mass before the killer could draw breath to scream blood, spraying across moldering supplies as the corpse spun like a dancer before crashing into a pile of rotting grain sacks. Sanderson dove behind an overturned table, his sawed-off shotgun roaring like thunder as it blew fist-sized holes in the wall where Boone's head had been milliseconds before. Splinters and dust filled the air like a localized sandstorm. Dutch himself didn't draw immediately. Instead, he watched with the cold satisfaction of a man savoring a long-anticipated meal, drinking in every detail of the violence he'd orchestrated. When his ivory-handled Remington finally cleared leather, a 16th birthday gift from the man he now hunted like a rabid animal, his movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial. You stole my blood for the law. Dutch set his first shot, splintering the door frame near Boone's ear with surgical precision. Now I'll spill yours for gold that should have been mine from the beginning. The room exploded into chaos as gun smoke filled the air, like fog, making it nearly impossible to distinguish friend from foe. the acrid stench of black powder mixed with the sweet smell of blood and the dry dust of decades. Boone managed to put a bullet in Pike's shoulder, spinning the killer around and sending his return shot wild. But he found himself pinned behind Hank Whitlock's skeleton, using the dead man's bones as cover, a desecration that made his soul ache with shame. Josie crouched beside him, clutching something against her chest, with hands that shook like autumn leaves in a high wind. In the middle of the gunfight's thunder and chaos, she leaned close to his ear. "The tube," she whispered urgently, barely audible over the sound of flying lead and splintering wood. "Papa made me swear on my mother's grave to protect it, no matter what happened to either of us." Her hand disappeared into her father's ribcage with movements that were practiced despite obvious terror. She'd done this before, probably many times during her months of captivity. What she withdrew made Boone's blood turn to ice water in his veins, a silver tube, thin as a pencil and about 4 inches long, covered in dried blood and bone fragments, but unmistakably valuable. "This is what they're really after," she said, holding it up with reverent care. "Papa swallowed it before they killed him, said it was worth more than all the gold in California, worth more than his life or mine." Before Boone could respond, a new sound cut through the gunfight's thunder, not Dutch's remaining men, but the unmistakable rumble of many hoofbeats approaching fast across the hardpan. Not 4 or 5 horses, but what sounded like a full cavalry charge. Through the bullet-shattered windows, blue uniforms became visible through the dust cloud, sabers gleaming like lightning in the desert sun. "This is Captain Ross Briggs' 5th Cavalry Regiment." The voice carried absolute military authority, trained on parade grounds and tested in battle. "The building is completely surrounded. Throw down your weapons and surrender immediately." Dutch's face went pale beneath his prison-tan confusion, replacing confidence for the first time since he'd entered the shack. "What in the hell? How did the army know to come here?" The answer came from Josie, who reached into her shoe with her free hand and withdrew a folded piece of paper yellow with age and stained with what looked like dried tears. Her voice was steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "Papa wrote this before they tortured him to death. Made me promise to keep it hidden till the soldiers came looking. He said they'd know what it meant, said they'd understand why he had to die protecting it." Boone unfolded the paper with hands that trembled from more than just the adrenaline of combat. The writing was shaky, but legible, the final words of a dying man who'd used his last moments to ensure his daughter's survival. "To Commanding Officer Fort Churchill, Lieutenant Henry Whitlock, Military Intelligence Division, reporting final mission status. Primary objective secured as ordered. Dutch Carver has compromised the operation and eliminated 2 fellow agents. My daughter Josephine holds proof of service and mission completion. Request immediate extraction and protection for civilian asset. The Confederate gold network runs deeper than we suspected. Trust no one at territorial level." The revelation hit Boone like a physical blow, rewriting everything he thought he knew about the situation. Hank Whitlock hadn't been a prospector at all. He'd been a Union intelligence officer still operating years after the war's official end, hunting Confederate sympathizers who continued their rebellion through financial sabotage and territorial corruption. The gold that Dutch had been chasing with such desperate fury was probably payment for covert operations that couldn't appear in any official military record. Operations that had cost at least 3 federal agents their lives. "Josie," Boone whispered, trying to process this information, while bullets continued to fly around them like angry hornets. "Your father wasn't mining for gold, was he?" She shook her head, tears finally beginning to fall, and cut tracks through the grime on her face. "He worked for the government. Special assignments, he called them. Said someday when I was grown and could understand, he'd explain why he had to leave me alone so much, why we moved from place to place like tumbleweeds." Outside, Captain Briggs was shouting orders with the crisp efficiency of a career military officer who'd learned his trade in the crucible of war. Soldiers were surrounding the shack with professional precision, but they weren't approaching this like a simple arrest. They moved like men expecting serious resistance carbines at the ready, and faces grim with deadly purpose. But Dutch wasn't finished playing his hand. As the reality of his situation began to sink in, surrounded by federal troops facing charges far more serious than simple murder, something fundamental snapped inside him. The carefully controlled facade he'd maintained throughout his criminal career began to crack like ice in spring, revealing the rage and desperation beneath. Pike. He roared with the fury of a cornered animal. "Burn it. Burn the whole damn place down. If I can't have what's mine, nobody gets it." Pike, despite the bullet wound in his shoulder that painted his shirt crimson, grinned with vicious anticipation at the order. From his saddlebags, he produced a bottle of lamp oil and a handful of matches, the tools of an arsonist's trade. "Been wanting to torch this death trap for months, boss. This place smells like hell anyway." The threat of fire changed everything in an instant. In the desert heat, the sun-dried wood of the shack would go up like kindling soaked in coal oil. Boone realized they had perhaps minutes before the building became a death trap from which there would be no escape. "Dutch, don't do this," Boone called out, trying to reach whatever remained of the boy he'd once known beneath layers of hatred and violence. "There's a child in here, an innocent child who never did you any harm. Should have thought of that before you destroyed my life." Dutch's voice cracked with emotion for the first time, revealing the pain beneath his rage. 8 years, Calder, 8 years in hell because you couldn't mind your own damn business, because you had to be the righteous man who always did what the law said was right. But as Pike prepared to splash oil across the dry wooden walls, the truth that Josie clutched in her small hands was about to reveal itself in the most dramatic way possible. She stood up suddenly, the silver tube held high above her head, like a flag of surrender or perhaps defiance. But there was something else in her other hand, something she'd been hiding even from Boone. Her final secret held in reserve for this exact moment. "Stop," she screamed, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "I got something else. Something Dutch needs to know before anybody burns anything or kills anybody else." The gunfire ceased, as if someone had thrown a switch, leaving only the sound of heavy breathing and the creak of old wood settling in the desert wind. All eyes turned to the skeletal girl who stood trembling but defiant in the center of the room, holding what looked like destiny in her small hands. "What are you talking about, girl?" Dutch demanded, but uncertainty flickered in his eyes for the first time since entering the shack. Josie reached into the lining of her dress, a hiding place she'd sewn shut months ago with careful stitches, and withdrew a second artifact. This one was a copper capsule green with age and sealed with military wax that had somehow survived the desert heat. "Papa said this was for you specifically, Mr. Carver," she said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Said you had a right to know the truth before you died. Said maybe if you knew what really happened 8 years ago, you might choose different this time." Dutch's gun hand wavered as he stared at the capsule, confusion replacing certainty. "What truth? What are you talking about?" "The truth about why Mr. Boone turned you in 8 years ago. The truth about what you were really doing with those Confederate sympathizers you thought were just harmless old soldiers missing the glory days." The words hit Dutch like physical blows, each syllable a hammer strike against the foundation of his hatred. His face cycled through disbelief, rage, and something approaching fear. "I was just running messages for pocket money. Just earning drinking money from old soldiers who missed talking about the war. Open it," Josie said simply, extending the capsule toward him like an offering. "Papa made me promise to give it to you if we ever met face to face. Said you deserved to know what kind of man you really were before the devil claimed your soul." The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring ready to snap. Outside, Captain Briggs was coordinating his men with professional efficiency, but he seemed to sense that something crucial was happening inside the shack. The soldiers held their positions, but didn't advance, waiting for orders that didn't come. Dutch took the capsule with hands that shook slightly, his gun forgotten for the moment. When he broke the wax seal and unrolled the document inside, his face went through a series of transformations, surprise, understanding, and finally a kind of broken recognition that spoke of a man's entire worldview crumbling. "This can't be right," he whispered, but his voice lacked conviction. "This has to be some kind of trick, some lie cooked up to make me doubt myself." The document was an intelligence report written in Hank Whitlock's careful script, but dated 8 years earlier. Confederate Network Final Assessment Asset. Dutch Carver has been fatally compromised. Subject was recruited by rebel sympathizers to transport stolen federal payroll funds to Mexican safe houses. Network includes detailed plans for armed uprising in Arizona territory, targeting Union loyalists and federal installations. Recommend immediate arrest to prevent wider conspiracy. Agent Calder Boone's intelligence on subject's activities has prevented potential massacre of Union supporters in Tucson. Subject unaware of true nature of his activities, but poses extreme danger if allowed to continue. The truth crashed over Dutch like an avalanche, burying 8 years of carefully nurtured hatred beneath an overwhelming weight of revelation. For nearly a decade, he'd nursed his rage like a precious flame, convinced that Boone had betrayed an innocent boy to satisfy some rigid sense of law and order. Now he learned that he'd been actively working against the Union he thought he was serving, carrying plans for rebellion that would have cost hundreds of innocent lives. The messages he'd carried hadn't been harmless reminiscences from old soldiers, but detailed intelligence about federal troop movements, lists of Union sympathizers marked for assassination, and financial records of stolen government funds being funneled to Confederate cells across the Southwest. "I wasn't innocent," Dutch said quietly, more to himself than anyone else in the room. "Jesus Christ Almighty, I was never innocent at all." The weight of realization seemed to crush him physically. He'd spent nearly a decade building his entire identity around being wronged, around being the victim of Boone's betrayal. Now that foundation had crumbled like sand, leaving him staring into the abyss of his own culpability. But Pike blood loss, making him increasingly desperate and vicious, chose that moment to make his final play. Despite his wound, he'd managed to splash oil across one wall during the tense exchange and was raising a lit match toward the tinder-dry wood. "Don't matter what papers say or what lies dead men tell," Pike snarled through gritted teeth. "Fire burns the same whether you're innocent or guilty, and I got a powerful need to see this place turn to ash." That's when the unexpected happened. A rifle shot cracked from outside the shack, not from the cavalry positions, but from somewhere else entirely. Pike spun around with a hole through his chest, the match flying from nerveless fingers to land harmlessly in the dust. But the shot hadn't come from Captain Briggs or his men. A figure emerged from behind a pile of abandoned mining equipment near the shack, a grizzled man in civilian clothes carrying a military-issue Springfield rifle. His appearance was so unexpected that everyone in the room froze for a crucial moment, trying to process this new development. "Sorry I'm late to the party, boys," the newcomer said with calm authority, never taking his eyes off Dutch and his remaining men. Sergeant Major William Morrison retired. Mr. Whitlock sent word before he died that there might be serious trouble brewing out here in the middle of nowhere. Another impossible twist in a situation that had already defied belief. Morrison moved with the careful precision of a career soldier, his rifle covering Dutch, while his experienced eyes swept the room, taking in Josie's condition and Boone's defensive position with professional assessment. "You boys picked the wrong federal agent to torture and kill," Morrison continued conversationally, as if discussing the weather. "Hank Whitlock saved my worthless hide 3 times during the war, pulled me out of more tight spots than I care to remember. Figured I owed him the courtesy of looking after his little girl when the time came." Dutch's remaining men, Sanderson and one other whose name Boone had never caught, were beginning to panic as their tactical situation deteriorated rapidly. Surrounded by cavalry, outgunned by experienced killers, and now facing another deadly opponent, Their options were evaporating like morning dew in the desert sun. "Give it up, Dutch." Boone called out, hoping to reach whatever remained of the boy he'd once cared about beneath all the layers of violence and hatred. "It's over. Has been for years, you just couldn't see it through all that rage." But Dutch Carver had one more card to play, and the most dangerous kind of man is one who has lost everything and no longer cares about consequences. Instead of surrendering or continuing the gunfight, he made a move that surprised everyone in the room. Moving with desperate speed, he grabbed Josie by the arm, pressing his ivory-handled Remington against her temple hard enough to leave marks on her skin. The girl's eyes went wide with terror, but she didn't struggle or cry out. "Maybe it is over," Dutch said with eerie calm that was somehow more frightening than his earlier rage. "Maybe I was the villain all along. Maybe every choice I made was wrong from the beginning. But I'm taking some satisfaction with me to hell, and I'm starting with the man who destroyed my life." The standoff reached its absolute crisis point. Through the bullet-shattered windows, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Not reinforcements for Dutch, but additional cavalry units called in by Captain Briggs. The net was closing from all sides, but Dutch seemed beyond caring about tactical considerations. That's when the desert itself intervened in the form of something that transformed the entire situation. Through the broken windows came a sound that made everyone pause, a low, continuous rumble like distant thunder, but coming from the wrong direction and lasting too long to be natural. The wind shifted suddenly, and with it came something that changed the very air around them. A wall of sand and grit dark as Judgment Day was rolling across the wasteland toward them with the inexorable force of natural disaster. "Sandstorm," Morrison shouted over the rising wind, his military training recognizing the danger immediately. "Big one coming fast, everyone take cover." The approaching storm transformed everything in an instant. What had been a tense standoff between armed men became a desperate struggle for survival against forces beyond human control. Visibility began to drop as the leading edge of the storm reached them, sand beginning to pour through every crack and bullet hole in the shack's walls. Dutch still held Josie hostage, but the gun at her temple wavered as he tried to process this new development. The cavalry outside could be heard shouting orders and trying to control horses that were going wild with instinctive fear of the approaching storm. Inside the shack, the remaining combatants found themselves thrust into an alien world of howling wind and flying debris. Sand poured through every opening like water through a broken dam, making it nearly impossible to see or breathe. The air became thick as soup, each breath a struggle against particles that seemed determined to fill their lungs. Dutch, wounded and bleeding from his earlier confrontation, pressed himself against the far wall, his ivory-handled gun still pointed at Josie, but trembling in his grip. But something fundamental had changed in him, and the revelation about his past had cracked the foundation of his hatred, leaving him hollow and confused. "I never knew," he said, his voice barely audible over the storm's growing fury. 8 years of rage, 8 years of planning revenge, and I never knew I was the villain in my own story. Boone crouched beside a support beam, trying to shield himself and position for a clear shot if the opportunity arose. "Knowing and choosing are different things, Dutch. You can still choose different now, even after everything that's happened." Through the chaos, Captain Briggs's voice could be heard on the wind, trying to coordinate his men, despite conditions that made normal military operations impossible. But the storm had created a strange pause in the violence, as if nature itself demanded a moment of reckoning. That's when Josie revealed her final secret, the one that would change everything one last time and rewrite everyone's understanding of the situation. "There's something else?" she said somehow, making her voice carry over the storm's howl. Reaching into a hidden pocket that none of them had noticed before, she withdrew something that made everyone in the room stop breathing. It was a small metal badge, tarnished with age, but unmistakably official, the kind carried by federal law enforcement officers on their most dangerous assignments. Papa wasn't just intelligence. she said, holding the badge where everyone could see it despite the swirling sand. He was hunting something bigger than Confederate sympathizers. Judge Marcus Crenshaw's been stealing federal Reconstruction money using people like Dutch to move it around the territory. Papa was building a case against the whole network. The badge was from the Department of Justice, a federal marshal's star that carried authority across all territorial boundaries. Hank Whitlock hadn't just been a spy. He'd been a lawman investigating territorial corruption at the highest levels of government. Crenshaw. Morrison's voice carried shock and recognition. That son of a bitch has been playing both sides for years, taking federal money with one hand and Confederate gold with the other. But the most stunning revelation was yet to come. As if summoned by the storm itself, a new voice cut through the wind, one that made Captain Briggs go rigid with surprise and Morrison raise his rifle with sudden suspicion. "Stand down, Captain." The voice commanded with federal authority. "This operation is now under Department of Justice jurisdiction." A figure appeared in the doorway, sand-scoured and grim, fighting against the storm's fury. A tall man in a dust-covered suit, his coat blown open to reveal a federal marshal's badge identical to the one Josie held. But his face was familiar to Morrison, who had served with enough federal agents to recognize trouble when he saw it. Deputy Marshal Thomas Wade. The newcomer announced, shouting to be heard over the wind. "I've been tracking this corruption conspiracy for months, following the money trail across 3 territories. Wade's supposed to be in Denver." Morrison muttered, his rifle never wavering from its target. "What's he doing here in the middle of a sandstorm?" That's when the final twist revealed itself in all its terrible complexity, rewriting the story on Last Time. Wade's eyes found Dutch through the swirling sand, and something passed between them, recognition, shared history, and something much darker. "Hello, Dutch," Wade said quietly, his voice somehow carrying despite the storm. "Been a long time since you carried messages for me and my associates." The truth exploded like a bomb in the confined space, more shocking than any of the revelations that had come before. Wade wasn't hunting the conspiracy, he was part of it, possibly even its leader. The federal marshal had been using Dutch as an unwitting courier years ago, then abandoned him when Boone's investigation got too close to the truth. Now he'd come to clean up loose ends, to eliminate witnesses and recover evidence that could destroy everything he'd built. "You son of a bitch," Dutch whispered, understanding, flooding his features like sunrise after the darkest night. "You used me. Made me think I was helping old soldiers remember their glory days when I was really moving your stolen money around the territory." Wade's hand moved to his gun with practiced ease. "Nothing personal, boy. Just business that got complicated when your surrogate father there started asking the wrong questions." But he'd underestimated the rage of a man who just learned the full extent of his manipulation. Dutch's Remington came up with desperate speed, fueled by 8 years of misdirected anger, finally finding its true target. His shot took Wade's center mass as the corrupt marshal tried to draw the bullet, punching through expensive cloth and crooked flesh with satisfying finality. Wade staggered backward, looking down at the spreading blood on his shirt with genuine surprise. Wasn't supposed to end this way. He gasped and then collapsed into the sand that was accumulating like snow against the shack's walls. The storm began to subside as quickly as it had risen, the way desert weather often did, revealing a transformed landscape scoured clean by wind and sand. Through clearing air, Captain Briggs appeared with his men, weapons ready, but uncertain what they'd find in the aftermath of nature's fury. "Marshal Wade." Briggs called out, then stopped short when he saw the body sprawled in the doorway. What the hell happened here? Morrison lowered his rifle, at last satisfied that the immediate danger had passed. "Justice, Captain." Finally caught up with a man who'd been running from it for too long. Dutch sagged against the wall, his gun falling from nerveless fingers as the last of his strength and hatred drained away. The revelation about Wade had completed the circle of understanding. He hadn't been betrayed by Boone. but used by the very system he'd thought he was fighting against. What remained was just a broken soul seeking some kind of peace in the wreckage of his life. "Calder," Dutch said quietly, his voice barely audible over the settling dust. "I'm sorry. For everything. For believing Wade's lies, for hunting you across 3 territories, for what I'd done to that little girl and her father. I'm sorry for being too proud and too angry to see the truth when it was right in front of me." Boone knelt beside his former protege, seeing not the killer Dutch had become, but the confused boy he'd once been before the world twisted him into something unrecognizable. "I know, son. I know you are. The boy I raised is still in there somewhere, underneath all that pain." Captain Briggs surveyed the scene with the methodical eye of a career soldier, dead killers scattered around the room, a wounded outlaw who just shot a corrupt federal marshal, evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. His expression was grim, but satisfied, like a man who'd finally seen justice served after too many years of watching criminals escape consequence. "Miss Whitlock," he said, gently approaching Josie with the careful movements of someone who understood trauma. "Your father's mission is finally complete. The evidence you've protected through months of hell will bring down everyone involved in this corruption network." Josie looked down at the badge in her small hands, her father's final gift to justice, purchased with his life and her suffering. Then she looked up at Boone, who'd become something she'd never expected to find in this wasteland of violence and betrayal, hope incarnate, proof that good men still existed in a world that seemed determined to destroy them. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much but still believed in tomorrow. "Now," Boone said, helping her to her feet with gentle hands, "we make sure your father didn't die for nothing. And we figure out what kind of people we want to be with the choices we got left." The aftermath moved with the efficiency of military precision. Captain Briggs coordinated the removal of bodies, the collection of evidence, and the arrest of Dutch Carver on charges that would likely see him imprisoned for the rest of his natural life. But there was something different about this arrest, a sense that justice was finally being served rather than merely punishment being dispensed. Morrison approached Boone as soldiers secured the scene. His weathered face creased with something approaching approval. "You did good here, Boone. Saved the girl, stopped the corruption, gave that boy a chance to find some peace before the end. Doesn't feel like victory," Boone replied, watching as Dutch was helped into a wagon that would carry him to federal prison. "Too many people died for it to feel like anything but failure. That's what separates good men from bad ones," Morrison said quietly. "Good men feel the weight of what they have to do. Bad men enjoy it." 3 weeks later, Lieutenant Henry Whitlock was buried with full military honors at the federal cemetery outside Fort Churchill. The ceremony was attended by officials from Washington, territorial politicians suddenly eager to distance themselves from Crenshaw's conspiracy, and a small girl who'd become the key witness in the most significant corruption case in Nevada Territory's history. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of the conspiracy Wade had masterminded. Federal Reconstruction funds had been systematically diverted, territorial elections rigged through intimidation and vote buying, and Union loyalists murdered or driven from their homes by Confederate sympathizers who believed they were fighting for a noble cause. Judge Marcus Crenshaw was found dead in his chambers 3 days after Wade's death, apparently of a heart attack, brought on by the stress of his impending arrest. Several other territorial officials fled to Mexico rather than face federal prosecution. The corruption network that had operated for nearly a decade was finally dismantled, its roots torn up and exposed to sunlight. But it was the personal aftermath that mattered most to those who'd fought in that desert shack. Dutch Carver was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, a surprisingly lenient sentence given his cooperation in exposing the wider conspiracy and the circumstances of his manipulation by Wade. Prison authorities noted that he was a model prisoner, never causing trouble, spending most of his time reading and writing letters he never sent. In one of those letters written 5 years into his sentence, he addressed Boone directly. "Uncle Calder, I know you'll never read this, but I need to write it anyway. I spent so many years hating you for turning me in, never understanding that you were trying to save me from myself. I was already lost when you made that choice. Lost the moment I decided that easy money was worth compromising my principles. You didn't destroy an innocent boy. You tried to stop a guilty one before he could hurt more people. I'm sorry it took me so long to understand. The boy you raised is still here, and he's finally learning what it means to be the man you tried to teach him to be." Dutch. Meanwhile, Josie flourished under federal protection and care. The government pension, combined with recovered funds from the corruption investigation, ensured her safety and education. But it was the network of people who'd fought beside her, Boone, Morrison, even Captain Briggs, who provided something more precious than money, a sense that the world contained people willing to risk everything for what was right. She attended the finest schools California could offer, proving to have inherited her father's sharp intelligence and unwavering moral courage. Law school followed naturally, then a career dedicated to helping children who'd suffered trauma and abuse. The work drew directly on her own experiences, but channeled them toward healing rather than revenge. The Whitlock Foundation, established with her inheritance and recovered federal funds, became legendary throughout the Western Territories for its ability to find and help children in desperate circumstances. Its motto, carved in stone above the headquarters in San Francisco, read simply, "Every chain can be broken." Captain Briggs returned to active duty with commendations and promotion, his handling of the Whitlock case cited as an example of military efficiency and moral courage. The intelligence recovered from Hank's final mission led to further investigations that cleaned up corruption in 3 other territories, establishing Briggs as one of the Army's most trusted officers. Morrison returned to his small ranch outside Carson City, where he lived quietly for the remainder of his years. He never spoke publicly about his role in the events at the Desert Shack, but local children often found him whittling toys on his front porch, always ready with stories about the importance of keeping promises and standing by friends. But it was Boone's transformation that proved most remarkable. The guilt that had haunted him since Arizona Territory, the weight of Sarah Mendez's death and Dutch's corruption, finally began to lift. Not because he'd found redemption in saving Josie, but because he'd learned to forgive himself for the choices he'd made with the best information available at the time. He found his calling in Montana Territory, where his reputation as a fair and honest mediator grew steadily over the years. Former outlaws, reformed gunfighters, and war veterans often sought him out, drawn by his reputation as a man who understood the weight of past mistakes without being crushed by them. The work suited him perfectly, helping communities resolve disputes without bloodshed, showing people that there were alternatives to violence when conflicts arose. He never married, never settled permanently in one place, but he helped dozens of towns and settlements find peace through negotiation rather than gunfire. He maintained a correspondence with Josie that evolved from formal exchanges to genuine affection as she grew into adulthood. Her letters brought news of her education, her legal career, and eventually her work with the foundation. His letters in return offered the kind of fatherly guidance she'd never received, advice about choices and consequences and the difference between justice and revenge. When she visited him in Helena during her 26th year, now a successful attorney and social reformer, they talked about chains and choices, about the weight of the past and the possibility of redemption. She was no longer the skeletal waif he'd found chained to her father's bones, but a confident woman who carried her scars with dignity. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me that day?" she asked during that visit, watching the Montana sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Boone considered the question seriously as he did all her inquiries. "I think about it sometimes. But dwelling on what might have been is just another kind of chain. Better to focus on what is and what still can be. The Foundation's work keeps growing, she told him. We found 12 children last month alone, some chained like I was, others trapped in different ways. But they all had one thing in common: they'd given up hope until someone showed them a different possibility. Your father would be proud, Boone said simply. He died believing that truth and justice would eventually prevail. You've made that belief real. On Boone's deathbed 18 years later, surrounded by friends and colleagues who'd come to respect his wisdom and fairness, his final words were about chains, how some bind us to the past, while others connect us to each other, and wisdom lies in knowing the difference. Josie held his hand as he passed peacefully in his sleep, grateful to the man who taught her that freedom meant choosing what to carry forward and what to leave behind. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people, whose lives Boone had touched, former enemies who'd found peace through his mediation. Children he'd helped escape dangerous situations, communities that had prospered because of his guidance. But it was Josie's eulogy that captured the essence of the man who'd become father, teacher, and inspiration to so many. Calder Boone taught me that we're all chained to something: our past, our mistakes, our fears, our love for others. The question isn't how to break free from all chains, but how to choose which ones are worth keeping. He chose to be chained to justice, to mercy, to the belief that people can change if they're given truth and the chance to choose again. Those are chains worth bearing, chains worth forging, chains that bind us not to our worst impulses, but to our better angels. Dutch Carver died in federal prison at age 47, his body worn down by incarceration, but his mind finally at peace. Among his personal effects were hundreds of unsent letters, a worn Bible, and a single photograph himself as a boy, standing beside young Calder Boone at some forgotten campsite. On the back, in careful handwriting refined through years of prison education, were 4 words: "Before I chose wrong." The prison chaplain noted that Dutch's last words were about forgiveness, not asking for it, but expressing wonder that it had been offered so freely by people he'd wronged. He died believing that redemption was possible even for those who'd made terrible choices, a belief that sustained him through his final years. The desert shack was eventually claimed by the elements, as such places always are, in the unforgiving landscape of Nevada. Wind and sand erased all traces of the tragedy and triumph that had unfolded within its walls, leaving only weathered foundation stones to mark where so many lives had been changed forever. But travelers passing through that stretch of desert sometimes reported seeing wildflowers growing where the building once stood. Desert blooms that survived in the harshest conditions, as if the earth itself was determined to create beauty from a place that had known such suffering and such grace. Morrison lived to see his 80th birthday, spending his final years teaching young men the skills of tracking and shooting and survival. But more importantly, the wisdom of knowing when not to use those skills. His funeral was simple, attended by the extended family of neighbors and friends he'd accumulated over decades of quiet service. Captain Briggs rose to the rank of colonel before retiring to write military histories, his account of the Whitlock case becoming required reading at West Point for courses on military ethics and civilian-military cooperation. He never forgot the lesson learned in that desert shack, that sometimes the most important battles are fought, not against foreign enemies, but against the corruption that threatens democracy from within. Years passed, and the story of the girl chained to her father's bones became legend throughout the American West, retold in mining camps and cattle towns from California to Colorado. But those who knew the truth understood that the real story wasn't about chains or bones or hidden treasure. It was about the moment when people choose between revenge and justice, between the easy path of hatred and the hard work of forgiveness. The Whitlock Foundation continued to grow under Josie's leadership, eventually operating across the entire western United States and helping thousands of children escape situations of abuse and neglect. Each child saved was a victory against the darkness that had once threatened to consume Josie herself, proof that suffering could be transformed into purpose. At the Foundation's 25th anniversary celebration, held in the same San Francisco building where Josie had first studied law, she spoke about the chains that had defined her life, the literal chain that had bound her to her father's bones, and the metaphorical chains that had connected her to everyone who'd fought for her freedom. Some chains are made of iron. She told the audience of donor social workers and rescued children who'd grown into productive adults. Others are made of love, of duty, of the connections that bind us to each other and to our better selves. My father died in chains, but he chose to be bound by his oath to serve justice. Calder Boone lived in chains, 2 chains of responsibility, of conscience, of the refusal to abandon those who needed help. These are the chains that matter, the chains that make us human. The speech was widely reported in newspapers across the country, inspiring similar organizations in other regions and helping to establish the principle that society had an obligation to protect its most vulnerable members. The work Josie began in Nevada territory eventually influenced national policy on child welfare and federal law enforcement. But perhaps the most fitting memorial to those who'd fought in the desert shack was the garden that Josie established behind the Foundation's headquarters. It contained plants from every territory, where the Foundation operated hardy desert flowers that bloomed despite harsh conditions, mountain plants that thrived in thin-air prairie grasses that survived drought and fire. At the garden's center stood a simple stone marker engraved with words that captured the essence of what they'd all learned in that place of death and transformation, in memory of those who chose to break chains of hatred and forge chains of love. Lieutenant Henry Whitlock, who died for truth; Calder Boone, who lived for justice; William Morrison, who stood for friendship; Dutch Carver, who found redemption; and all who understand that the strongest chains bind us not to our past, but to our promise of a better tomorrow. Visitors to the garden often found Josie there in the evenings, tending to plants that bloomed against all odds, much like the hope that had sustained her through her darkest hours. She would speak to them sometimes, not about the famous case that had made her a national figure, but about the small acts of kindness that had made her survival possible. A peddler who'd thrown bread through a broken window. A federal marshal who'd honored his promise to a dying friend. A bounty hunter who'd chosen a child's life over his own safety. These were the real heroes of her story, people who'd made choices that seemed small at the time, but proved to be the difference between despair and hope. On her 70th birthday, Josie published her memoirs, a book that became an immediate bestseller and inspired a new generation of social reformers. The final chapter, titled "Chains Worth Choosing," ended with words that summarized everything she'd learned about human nature and the power of individual choice. We are all prisoners of something: our circumstances, our history, our fears, our limitations. But we are also the keepers of our own keys. Every day we choose which chains to accept and which to break, which bonds to honor and which to reject. The chains that held me to my father's bones were broken by force, but the chains that connected me to those who saved me were forged by choice, their choice to risk everything for a stranger. My choice to trust in their goodness, despite everything I'd suffered. These are the chains that matter, the bonds of compassion that connect us across all boundaries of race and class and circumstance. The ties of duty that bind us to something larger than ourselves. The connections of love that make us willing to sacrifice for others' welfare. These chains don't imprison us. They liberate us to become more than we ever could be alone. In the end, freedom isn't the absence of chains, but the wisdom to choose which chains deserve our allegiance. I choose to be chained to hope, to justice, to the belief that every person deserves the chance to break free from whatever imprisons them and to forge new bonds with those who will help them flourish. This is the legacy of those who died in the Nevada desert and those who lived to carry their work forward. This is the promise we make to every child who suffers, every adult who struggles, every person who has ever felt abandoned by the world. You are not alone. Your chains can be broken. And there are people willing to help you forge new connections that will sustain and strengthen you. Some chains bind us to the past. Others chain us to each other. The wisdom lies in knowing the difference and in choosing our bonds with the same care we use to choose our freedom. The book's success led to speaking engagements across the country, where Josie shared her story with audiences who marveled at her resilience and wisdom. But she always insisted that she was not the hero of her own story, that honor belonged to those who'd chosen to act when action was dangerous to care, when caring was costly to believe in justice, when injustice seemed to rule the world. In her final years, as she felt the approach of the end that comes to all mortal things, Josie returned one last time to the Nevada desert where her transformation had begun. The shack was long gone, claimed by wind and weather, but she could still feel the presence of those who'd shaped her destiny in that place of suffering and salvation. Standing in the desert wind with wildflowers blooming at her feet, she spoke aloud the words she'd carried in her heart for more than half a century. "Papa, I kept my promise. I guarded what you left me, and I used it to help others find their freedom. Mr. Boone, I learned the lessons you taught about choosing what chains to wear and which to break. Mr. Morrison, I never forgot that friendship sometimes means risking everything for people who can't repay the debt. Even you, Dutch, I learned that redemption is possible for anyone willing to face the truth about themselves and choose to be better." She died peacefully in her sleep 3 months later, surrounded by the extended family of colleagues and friends who'd become her closest bonds. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by her work, former clients who'd become successful adults, social workers who'd been inspired by her example, politicians who'd supported her reforms. But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from an unexpected source, a letter found among her papers after her death, written by Dutch Carver decades earlier, but never sent. "Miss Josie, I know I got no right to write to you after what I'd done, but I wanted you to know that thinking about you helped me find my way back to being human. You showed mercy to a man who didn't deserve it, and that mercy became the seed of whatever good grew in me afterward. I hope someday I can meet you in whatever comes after this life. And thank you proper for teaching me that forgiveness is stronger than revenge, that love is stronger than hate, that hope is stronger than despair. You saved my soul that day in the desert, and I wanted you to know that it mattered, that it changed everything. Dutch Carver." The letter was read at Josie's funeral by the foundation's new director, a woman who'd been rescued from an abusive situation as a child and had dedicated her life to continuing Josie's work. The words brought tears to many eyes, reminding everyone present that the ripples of a single act of courage and compassion can spread across decades, touching lives in ways that can never be fully measured. As the sun set over the California hills where Josie was laid to rest, a desert wind carried the scent of wildflowers and the same hardy blooms that had grown where a shack once stood, where a girl had been chained to her father's bones, where people had chosen to break the chains of hatred and forge new bonds of hope. The story was complete at last. Every debt paid, every question answered, every chain finally understood. For what it truly was, not always a prison, but sometimes the strongest connection between souls who'd chosen to care for each other despite the cost. In the end, that was enough. More than enough for a world that often seemed to reward cruelty and punish kindness, but that still produced people willing to risk everything for the simple belief that every life had value, every person deserved hope, and every chain could be broken by those brave enough to choose love over fear. The chains that had bound them all to the past, to each other, to the endless work of building a more just world, had been transformed from shackles into lifelines, connecting them across time and space and death itself, to the eternal human struggle to choose light over darkness, hope over despair, love over hate. And in that transformation, they had found the only freedom that truly mattered, the freedom to choose who they would be, what they would stand for, and which chains they would forge to bind them to their better angels, rather than their darker impulses. The desert wind carried their story across the vast expanse of the American West, where new generations would face their own choices about chains and freedom, justice and mercy, revenge and redemption. And in the telling of their tale, those who came after would find the same truth that had sustained them all, that the strongest chains are made not of iron, but of love. And those chains, chosen freely and worn with honor, do not imprison us. They set us free to become more than we ever dreamed possible.